Why do people fight? How is it proven possible for over millennia for nations to send out great armies of young men to fight great armies of young men from other nations over and over again? Is there something innate in human nature that makes this possible? Why don't the young men just say, "Stuff this, I'm going home to read a book if it's all right by you"? And yet they don't. They don't. So that's what I'm going to try to get to grips with in this video, which has been sponsored by The Great Courses Plus. Thank you to them, but more of that later. Now, aiding me in my quest is the fact that I've read a book. Oh yes, a whole book. Why We Fight by Mike Martin, so it says on the cover. I think the publisher's being a bit informal there. I think I would have called him Dr. Michael Martin. So who's he then? Well, he went to Oxford University, got a degree in biology, joined the army, served in Afghanistan, came back, got a doctorate in war and stuff, and now he's a researcher at King's College London in the Department of War Studies. So I think it's reasonable to imagine that he knows his stuff. He takes a particular approach, which I rather approve of. I think it's right to look at this from the angle of biology. What in human biology makes this possible? Now, a word of warning here. If you are the sort of person who is thoroughly convinced that all of humanity was created in one instant by a divine being who, poof, created it in a puff of logic, then you may have a tough time agreeing with what I'm going to be saying from now on. But if, on the other hand, you're someone who finds it easy to accept the idea that we are animals, we are part of the animal kingdom, we are related to the other great apes, and that we evolved over many, many generations, then you're going to have an easier time of it. You also have to believe that there is such a thing as human nature, which I'm completely convinced that this is the case. Tribesmen all around the world, no matter how isolated, they laugh when they find something funny, they cry when they're miserable. Their basic instincts are the same as ours. And just as cats are different from dogs, and we don't teach cats how to be feline and dogs how to be canine, they're just like that. That's their nature. Well, I think that humans are born with an innate nature. Of course, nurture plays a role, but there is such a thing as human nature, human instinct. So, what do people fight for? There are loads of things that are put forward. Oh, they fight for religion, they fight for money, and so forth. But it seems that when you peer behind the curtain and boil it all down and otherwise mix your metaphors, it comes down to just two things: status and group membership, or belonging if you prefer. Now, what status? Status is good if you're male. Status, you could say, is good for everyone, but if you're male, in evolutionary terms, it's super good. Now, 80% of all the women who have ever lived contributed to the current gene pool. So, looking at it very broadly, if you're female, then regardless of your status, you're probably going to breed. But if you were male, it's not so easy at all. In fact, only 40% of all the men who've ever lived have contributed to the current gene pool. Most men died childless. Most men failed in the basic evolutionary mission of passing on genes. So, men really have to struggle to breed, and the main thing which defines how likely a man is to breed is status. High status men bred a lot, and low status men usually didn't breed at all. So status is vital for men. So it is therefore entirely understandable that they would evolve instincts which make them seek status. Status doesn't just give you access to mates, it gives you loads more things. It gives you security, gives you access to resources like food, and it means that you're definitely a group member, because if you're high status within a group, he's definitely one of us. I mean, he might even be the leader of the group, which defines the group. So no one can say he's not one of us, he's the flipping leader of the group. So status, if you're male, is terrific. And when you say, right, we're going to have a war then, we're going to attack those guys over there, you might, as a lofty high status leader, say, and the reason we're doing it is for a lofty ideal which I'm going to describe tomorrow, but for the moment let's go and attack. It could be that the reason you're actually starting this war as a leader is for your own status reasons. You're trying to boost your own status, and perhaps you're trying to defeat an enemy leader. And how can you defeat an enemy leader? How can you, that rival, without the help of your whole tribe? You can't do it on your own, but you can motivate your whole tribe to create a war, and then you can defeat and topple that other leader, and yeah, will your status rocket, and that will be good. So it's fairly easy to explain why a leader might want to go to war for status reasons. But for the followers, it's a lot harder. Why do groups go to war? Why does the ordinary trooper go to war? For status? Well, yes, you can raise your status, that's true. if you go to war, you might prove that you're definitely a member of the group because, well, if he's served alongside us fighting against our enemies, he must be one of us, right? So yeah, that's one way to prove that you're a member of the group. You can become a mighty warrior, and you can score victories and so forth, and you might capture resources. So yeah, there are various benefits you can get from going to war, but you've got to look at what biologists call fitness. Fitness is your ability to contribute long-term to the gene pool, pass on genes. How can you survive and reproduce? How can you become fitter by going to war? Do you become fitter by going to war? Well, if you're an ordinary trooper, the answer is no, you don't. The main way you can reproduce, if you're male, is to stay with your family, with your girlfriend, with your wife, and with your support group back home, and breed with that and raise kids. That's the way to do it. Don't go off to war away from your main opportunity for breeding. Yeah, you might get a captive girl pregnant, but probably not. And yeah, it doesn't outweigh the advantages of just doing it the main way. And if you go to war, you're very likely to die. And don't forget that if you're going to war, you're probably young, which means you probably don't have kids yet. So if you die before you've ever had kids, that's your fitness reduced to 0. And if you get badly wounded, that's also going to badly affect your ability to pass on genes, raise kids in the long term, be attractive to future mates. So don't go to war, because the drawbacks, the lowering of fitness from being away from your main breeding opportunities, from risking injury and death, those can significantly outweigh the increase in fitness that I've already described. So we would then most certainly evolve the instinct not to go to war, wouldn't we? If you're a lower status guy, you would not want to go to war, because that's going to lower your fitness, your ability to reproduce even more. And yet, that's not what we observe, do we? In fact, at the beginning of World War I in 1914, the rush for conscription across all classes was so great that the British Army was turning away everyone under 6 foot. And just think, people were shorter in those days. Now, of course, later on in the war, they were getting short of manpower, and they even raised bantam regiments, who, ironically, so it is said, proved particularly suited to trench warfare. But anyway, at first, everyone wanted to be on the action. Ordinary men were chucking away their jobs and running down the road to the recruiting station. The society didn't have to persuade men to join up. If anything, it's have to persuade men to not join up by putting the limitation on the height thing. So it seems that there is a drive. Men want to go to war. Why? The camaraderie? Yeah, you can see that's part of it, but maybe there's a bit more to it than that. Mike Martin himself reports this tremendous drive that he felt. In fact, he even says that the biggest rush of his life that he ever had, the biggest high, the biggest yes he ever felt, was when he was finally in contact with the enemy, something he and his mates had all been craving. They wanted contact with the enemy, and there they were amongst their mates. They got a great team together. The camaraderie, the feeling of fellowship was so intense, and every second was intense. The hormones were rushing around their bodies, the hearts were pumping, things were happening. We're going to do this. That was the biggest high of his life, and yet it's a taboo for him to say that. What he's supposed to say is that the greatest moment of his life was when his first child was born, or when he got married, or he met the woman of his dreams, or got his PhD, or something else. You're not supposed to say, yeah, I was killing people, it was great, I had a big gun. It's a bit of a taboo to say that you get such a rush from fighting, and yet that's what he reported. So that was presumably in his innate nature. Society hasn't told him to feel good when killing people. He just did feel that tremendous rush when I don't know if he killed anyone, but the point is he was in action. Society had, if anything, brought him up not to feel good about that sort of thing, and yet he did, suggesting very strongly that it was part of his innate instinctive nature to feel that way when he was doing that. So why did he want to be a member of that team doing that dangerous job? Well, one reason perhaps is that we copy our neighbours. Now, if you have a society, loads of people living together, and you just give everyone the instruction, copy the guy next to you, then most of the time that's going to work, isn't it? I mean, if you lived your life with that as your default behaviour, you're probably going to do all right. You look around and there's a society which is functioning, people have got houses and the food is getting grown and so forth. So if you just copy what other people are doing, then it's probably going to work because society appears to be working. Now, of course, if everybody does nothing but copy the person next to them, then if anything changes, that'll be a disaster. You need about 15% of the population to be mavericks, if you like. They're the ones who will adapt, who will try new things, invent the next improvement, and so forth. And you need someone who will say, hang on, the king's in the all together. You need someone to do that. But if about 85% of people, it seems, are just the sheep who just copy the people around them, and you need about 15% of mavericks to make sure that the whole thing doesn't spiral into disaster. So then it would be expected, wouldn't it, for humans to evolve an instinct to want to fit in. And it seems that we have. It is part of most people's innate nature to not want to be the odd one out. They want to be normal. They want to be like everyone else. They want to wear the same clothes. Why do we all wear the same sort of clothes all the time? Well, we copy our neighbours, and it's considered actually a taboo to wear outlandishly different dresses, because they are a clue to the fact that you're perhaps not one of us, one of the group, and playing the game and obeying the rules of society. So yes, most of us want to fit in, and if you were a god designing a human, designing a creature to live in large communities, in towns and so forth, you would perhaps program into that species the desire to fit in, to be normal, to copy those around. So if loads of other people are joining up for war, then maybe you should. That's one reason. You just a copying idea, but it's not enough of an explanation on its own, because why, for a start, why are those other people joining up? Why is it the norm to join up? And it does seem to be the norm. In World War I, if you didn't join up and do your bit, you were quite likely to be handed a feather, a white feather, to show that you were a coward. And the person handing you that feather was very likely to be a woman. It might be your own mother. So ashamed that her son was not playing his part in his society, not doing his bit for the society, the greater society, the people around her that she wishes to copy. Everyone else's sons are going to war, but my son is not going to war. Go to war. A mother might actually lower the reproductive fitness of her own son and try to shame him into going and risking his life on the front in World War I. Even knowing how dangerous it is, she might feel such shame that she wants to be normal so much that she will, to fit in with her friends whose sons are all at the front, some of whom have died, she will do that to her own son. So that's how normal it was right the way across society, not just amongst young men, but right the way across society, to send young men to war. So, is it vengeance? Is vengeance violent? You could say that vengeance is a bad thing, but actually, does vengeance increase or decrease the amount of violence in the world? You might think, well, surely it increases it. I mean, vengeance can actually manifest as violence, and violence itself can be a manifestation of vengeance. So yeah, vengeance increases the amount of violence in the world. But does it? Think of gorillas. Now, a lot of people will tell you that the gorillas are so peaceful. They want to think that, so that's what they tell you. That's what they tell themselves. Gorillas are so peaceful and they hardly ever fight. And that's true. Gorillas hardly ever fight. The reason gorillas hardly ever fight is that the male silverback gorillas are phenomenally violent. If you live in a group of gorillas and one of whom is a male silverback, you are one mistake away from being charged by an incredibly big, incredibly angry and strong thing. But this almost never happens. It almost never happens because all the other gorillas in the group, they know that that's what would happen if they stepped out of line, and that the male silverback is phenomenally strong and dangerous, so they don't. So male gorillas are so phenomenally violent that they almost never fight. Vengeance often comes from anger, and anger is an emotion, and emotions control us to a degree. So if I think, with my theory of mind, that someone else, if I did such and such a thing, would get really angry and then perhaps go out of control, and despite his rational nature, end up punching me repeatedly in the face, I won't do the thing. So his potential for anger and potential for vengeance means that I don't do the thing, so in fact there is no violence. The more potential we have for vengeance, the less violence there is in the world. And the emotion of anger helps this. It goes with the grain, because anger puts us out of control. We cannot be rational fools. We have to be emotional, acting beings, because our emotions sometimes take over. And knowing that, we don't transgress. No, that's just going to get him annoyed. And when he gets annoyed, he becomes dangerous and unpredictable. So I won't do that. And there are other apparently negative emotions that also have this advantage. Notice it's an advantage for group living. If we all lived solitary lives as hermits, vengeance wouldn't be part of our lives at all. We would never have anything to be vengeful for. But we don't. We live in groups, don't we humans? And we have negative emotions like guilt and shame. Well, guilt is the feeling inside of, oh, I've done a thing. Oh, I shouldn't have done that thing. What if other people find out that I've done that thing? They'll cast me out. They'll cast me out in the wilderness. They won't accept me as one of them anymore. I will be alone. Oh, I should not have done that thing. Right. So you never do that thing again, do you? You never repeat that. And having felt guilt because you did one bad thing, you now know what it's like to feel that guilt, and you do not want to feel that guilt again. So something else, you don't even do it once, because you know that you would feel incredibly guilty were you to do it, so you don't transgress, which is good for the society as a whole, because if everyone is holding themselves back from doing wrong, doing things that would anger those around them, then society ends up more peaceful. So hooray for guilt. And shame, what is shame other than a sort of public manifestation of guilt? You're showing guilt to those around you. Can you imagine if you didn't show shame? So everybody knows you've done the thing that was bad, that has annoyed everybody, and you show no contrition whatsoever. People will say, good Lord, he's completely shameless, right? He's got to go. Cast him out, send him out. He takes the long walk. So shame, guilt, anger, vengeance, these things actually, in the long term, keep groups together rather than breaking them apart. And emotions tend to be contagious. If somebody is showing fear, then other people, what? They become fearful as well. And that's actually, again, long term for a group living creature, contagion of emotion is quite a useful thing. If one person spots some danger, everyone is then alert to this potential danger. Now, if you gain status and group belonging, these are really good, again, long-term advantages. Now, I can give you some food. You could be a really good hunter. You could go and shoot a deer, bring it back, and then a week later, the food's been eaten or stolen or has gone rotten. It's gone. That resource has been used up. But status and group membership, they are probably lifetime things you get. If you win the VC, the medal, the Victoria Cross, the highest medal for gallantry that Britain can award, that outranks everything. You put that letter in front of all the other. You can get a degree. You can become a Fellow of the Royal Society, FRS. You can become a member of the Order of the British Empire, OBE. But all those letters come after VC. You've won the VC. You are so and so, VC, and then all the other various letters after your name, all the other honours. And no matter what you do, this is the rule, no matter what you do, you can never have a VC stripped from you. You can be stripped of a knighthood, you can be thrown out of the Royal Society, but if you've won a VC, it doesn't matter how many crimes you commit after that you get caught and convicted for, you are still, till your dying day, somebody, VC. So it's really worth doing a lot to win a VC, because that is a permanent status that will be benefit to you for the rest of your life. So by baubles are men led, or something like that, said Napoleon. And perhaps that goes a long way towards explaining why that be the case. Why are people doing such outrageous things sometimes, apparently, to win a medal? That's just bonkers. No, actually, in evolutionary terms, no, that can pay off. Now, humans are a dimorphic species. Dimorphism is the difference in shape and size between one sex and another. So with some birds, for instance, even an expert ornithologist cannot tell you if that's a male or a female just by looking at it from the outside. But with other species, the difference between the males and the females is colossal. And with humans, it's fairly significant. Males look fairly different from females and are quite a bit bigger and stronger. A man is in manual strength about double the strength of a woman, and upper body strength at least about 1.5 times stronger. And here's an interesting thought experiment. If you get an average man and 100 women of the same age chosen at random, how many of the women would you expect to be stronger than the man? He's an average man, remember, an average man. Most people, if you ask them this, they'll say 3, 2, something like that. The answer is actually none. About 1 woman in 1,000 is as strong as the average man. So there's really quite a big difference between men and women in fighting ability. And if that's the case, then it's like a cast iron law in biology, that you know that you're dealing with a species where one male will mate with multiple females and other males do not mate at all. So males have evolved to fight other males. That's why they're big and strong. Females of species tend to be the optimum size for the life that they live, for the environment they live in, for the food they eat and so forth. And males tend to be a little bit too big. It means that a lot of them die off of various causes. They're more vulnerable to diseases and to getting cold or too hot or whatever. But they need to be big and strong because they're optimized for fighting other males. And humans, to a degree, are about that way. We're about 15% taller than females. So that explains why humans are dimorphic, and we learn something about it. Okay, right, so if we're dimorphic, then this is probably in our nature. And there are, of course, plenty of polygynous societies, but these tend to be very small societies. Tiny tribes living on an island somewhere might still be polygynous, and polygynous societies have a much higher murder rate, much more violence. And that's easy to understand, isn't it? Because in a polygynous society, one guy gets several wives, so there are a load of guys at the bottom who stand no chance of getting a wife at all. They will never breed unless they do something to change this situation. They're low status, what can they do? Violence breaks out. If there's one woman who's available to all the lower status guys, they're all going to be fighting each other really, really strongly for that one woman, that vital resource for breeding. So there was a study done. This is a chilling stat for you. This is really chilling. You may be aware that because of China's one-child policy, coupled unfortunately with its cultural bias towards males because of their particular inheritance laws, well, people have looked at China's a massive empire. Okay, it's not homogenous. So they've looked at communities living around different bits of China, and they've done the maths and have found that if you increase the male to female ratio by 0.01%, this correlates with a 3% rise in the murder rate. Yikes! Now, when I say 3% rate rise in the murder rate, if it goes from 0 to 0.01 extra ratio, that doesn't mean you get a 3% murder rate. And then if you do it again, it doesn't work like that, because imagine if you had a 1% rise, that would be a 300% murder rate. So everyone in the population would be killed 3 times over. No, it doesn't work like that. You've got a very small number which gets bigger by 3% to become a slightly bigger, very small number. But even so, 0.01% increase in the ratio of males to females leads to a 3% increase in the murder rate. Yikes! We know then that I'd say we can be fairly confident that the violence in males can be traced back to the fact that most males don't breed, and that there's a finite number of females available. And what do men actually kill each other over? Here I'm talking more about murder rather than war here. So why do men murder each other? Well, murderers, we can look at England. England has extremely good stats on this because we have an unbroken series of court records. I think this might be unique in the world, actually, going all the way back to 1300. So we can look at all the murder cases that go right the way back to there, have been recorded and have survived. So since 1300, 95% of murders in England have been committed by men. Yeah, that probably doesn't surprise you, does it? And 80% of those murdered were also men. Again, not a lot of surprise there. Men tend to kill other men, and it's usually young men killing other young men. Although, of course, one of the reasons that they were young was that it was the medieval period and people were younger on average back then. they tended to be poor, they tended to be unmarried, and they were murdering almost entirely people who were unrelated to them. Now, around the world, insane people sometimes kill people. Women sometimes kill people. There are various rare groups like that who will commit the occasional murder. But almost all the variation is in young men. So there's a base rate that is pretty much uniform across the world for insane people and women killing people. But some countries, the young men are killing loads of other young men, and in some countries, not so much. The rate at which they do this seems to be correlated quite strongly with the size of the society. I'll get onto that later, actually. So, why are they killing each other? That's because I want to get back to that. They're killing each other. Well, the actual trigger is usually phenomenally trivial, you might say. Oh, this guy was bragging and someone had to put him in his place. He cheated at cards. He looked at my wife funny. There are little triggers like that send people over the edge and cause them to burst into violence and to stab someone in the local tavern or whatever. But actually, it's reasonable, isn't it, to say that there's an underlying cause. They were actually murdering that guy for some other reason, and it seems to be to gain status or to protect what status you have. Women, on the other hand, murder, it seems, for different reasons. Women murder in self-defense to protect their children. It's pretty obvious why evolution would favor those behaviors. And sometimes they murder over competition for mates. A woman might kill another woman for stealing her man. But they're not killing for religious purposes or for money. And it seems that women don't kill for status because they don't have to. So that's a perfectly good reason not to. Men, and I said it's mostly young men, commit. Don't forget that in a lot of the past, a lot of men didn't live past 30, and not that many lived past 40. So in your 20s, you are establishing a reputation. And if you don't establish a reputation as a man in your 20s, you're probably never going to breed. That's the time when you've got to write the hit album, or get the really good job, or get recruited by the really good football team and become the centre forward and score lots of goals. Whatever, you've got to do the thing, whatever it is, to establish your reputation. And of course, one way to establish a reputation is you can fight other guys successfully. So it seems that guys in their 20s are really trying to prove themselves in their 20s, and that is one of the reasons, again, why they might go to war. You can prove yourself and establish your rep. You're someone with whom to be reckoned. Now, leaders, as I was saying, it's easier for leaders. It's easy to understand what I mean. It's easy to understand why a leader might want to start a war because, as I was saying, it's his way to defeat another leader. So Cameron, for instance, when Cameron was in power, that was when Gaddafi was falling, and a lot of people, this is described, this is straight out of here, Gaddafi was, Cameron was saying to people, we're going to get Gaddafi. And a lot of military people listening to him scratching their heads and feeling a bit worried. Alarm bells were going off. Sorry, is this a personal thing for you, David? That you, David, want to kill Gaddafi? Is that what you see as the mission here? Because we're military people and we're not into doing assassinations, and we're looking at this problem rather differently. But a load of people got the impression that what he really wanted to do, what David Cameron really wanted, was to kill Gaddafi, get Gaddafi. It becomes personal, one-to-one, one leader against another. That's going to establish my rep. I'm going to beat that guy. And people often personify the enemy as an individual. How many pictures have you seen of someone painting package for Mr. Hitler on a bomb that they're going to stick on a bomber in World War II, or stitch this Fritz? Now, Fritz isn't any specific German, but the whole of Germany becomes Fritz. This one individual. In our minds, we tend to anthropomorphize the whole of the enemy into a single person, a single identity. And it seems that Cameron wanted to just get Gaddafi. And if, of course, he got his victory, that would boost his popularity at home, he might feel. It's very often said, for instance, that Margaret Thatcher, and don't forget that Margaret Thatcher was actually not a very successful or popular politician before the Falklands crisis, but then when the Argentinians captured the Falklands, the enemy has been the aggressor. Nobody could blame her for what the fascist junta in Argentina did. She could then approve the sending of a task force down there, win a victory, and it did a huge, apparently, it did a huge boon of, it caused a huge boost to her popularity at home, and then she won another election. So a lot of people were really glad that she was in charge and not Michael Foot. What would he have done? So the leader benefits at home as well. The leader doesn't just benefit by conquering another leader and knocking out a rival and perhaps capturing that rival's tribe and increasing his domain, but also you get a boost within the group for a victory. So yeah, explaining leaders is easy. Now, when large groups fight each other, depends partly on how big the group is. So since 1400, looking at all the wars that have been fought, measuring them in size by looking at the number of casualties. Of course, some wars we can't be very sure, so you have to make guesses, or some wars you leave out because you just don't know. But where you can be reasonably sure of how many people became casualties during the war, that's one way of measuring the size of a war. So how does that correlate with how often those wars appear? Well, if a war is 10 times bigger, it is 2.6 times rarer. I know that's a rather strange way of putting it, but the basic point is, as wars get bigger, they get spaced out more in time. So the bigger the society, the bigger the war it can create, but it does so less and less often. Small groups of people living next to each other have little small wars very commonly, and bigger and bigger groups have fewer and fewer fights. And internally, they're more peaceful as well. So it's not exactly a 1-to-1 ratio. You have to multiply by 10 to get the time to space out by 2.6, but it's still a very definite ratio. And here's the interesting thing. It's constant regardless of the size. So that's not just true of big wars over the centuries. It's true of very small skirmishes between a few, right the way down to one bloke stabbing another bloke in a pub. It works at every scale, and over time and over a number of casualties. And if that's the case, then the big explanations break down. If you say, wars are fought by religions, it's the well, this huge area here is all this religion, and very seldom fights this other area of a different religion. And yet all these other people within it, they're all of the same religion, and yet they fight each other quite commonly. No, it doesn't seem to be religion that's causing these guys to fight. It's not that group fighting another group. Something else is involved here. Now, I want to talk to you about testosterone. Now, you've probably heard this. It's the hormone that makes a man, if you like. It's responsible, for instance, for this beard. So you can't say that testosterone is bad because it's responsible for beards, and beards are good, and that's a fact. And you can't argue with science. Now, testosterone, you probably know, makes people more aggressive. The trouble is, that's actually not true. Testosterone actually doesn't make people more aggressive. But we do find it in men far more than in women, and men are definitely a lot more physically aggressive than women. A man has about 7 to 8 times as much testosterone flowing through his veins. You may have come across the figure 20 times as much. There is a confusion here. Men produce about 20 times as much testosterone as women. There is some testosterone in women, but not so much. But because they are using it up so much faster than women, the level in their blood is about 7 to 8 times the testosterone level of a woman. Anyway, if you inject someone with a load of testosterone, you might make him very randy, very lustful, if you like. Americans say horny. And this also explains why the name Randy is not popular as a Christian name in Britain. But it doesn't make him aggressive, or her aggressive. Testosterone makes you want to seek status, which is a very male behavior. And it also makes you very keen to defend what status you have. Makes you perhaps a bit more touchy about your status. There was a huge, remember this made the news, there was a huge study done, I think it was in Italy, during a really big football match, some massive cup final somewhere. And they got people, they sampled people going in and they sampled people coming out. I think they were spitting saliva into a pot. And it was pretty easy for the researchers to work out which side someone was a supporter of, because he would be wearing the scarf, have the face paint and the shirt and all the rest of it. Yeah, okay. So you didn't even have to ask. You could just record which side they were a supporter of and then get the sample, give the number, and then do the analysis later. And they found, as you would expect, on the way in, everyone had roughly equal overall. The two sides, the two different football teams' supporters had roughly equal testosterone levels, but coming out, the winning side and the losing side, on average, had radically different testosterone levels. But which side had the greater? The losing side, not the winning side. The winning side didn't have anything to prove. They were just happy. Yay, my team won. Now let's just go to the pub and get drunk and go, yay, with my mates. It's fine. The losing side had just had a big threat to their status. They were supporting the losers. And they were not necessarily more aggressive, but they were more keen on asserting what status they had, asserting that they hadn't lost status and that they were still men to be reckoned with. So whilst they wouldn't necessarily kick off, initiate some violence, maybe if a load of drunken supporters from the winning side got a little bit too boisterous and were bragging too much and teasing too much and just pushed it a little bit much, and maybe one guy accidentally fell on someone else, it got misinterpreted, then the much more touchy and testosterone fueled losing side supporters might then kick something off. So it doesn't make you more aggressive, it makes you want to seek status that much more. The prefrontal cortex of the brain is that part of the brain which deals with complicated social problems. And it doesn't fully develop until the age of about 25. So if you are a young man and you don't have a fully functioning prefrontal cortex yet, people are sorting out the nuances of how to behave, usually in their teens, the big social problems. They're sorting them out in their teens and throughout their teens, and they haven't really sussed it until about 25. So yeah, older people are on some matters actually wiser. If you've got a problem and you're a low status man, you're not all that bright, maybe you're going to use violence as a way of solving that problem, because the Machiavellian brain, the way of solving these problems without anyone's having to fight, that you haven't learned that skill yet. So that's one explanation for why young men fight. They just don't have the brain capacity to solve problems any other way, which is rather unfortunate. Groups are safer places to be than being alone. If you get cast out of a group, you have no one else to defend, no allies, no one to advise you. You're responsible for everything now. You are on your own. Now, in the environment in which humans evolved, the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptation, to be cast out of a group of hunter-gatherers in, say, it might have been in Pleistocene Africa, there are loads of wolves, hyenas and tigers about. Sorry, not tigers, lions. Because it's Africa. That's really dangerous. To survive on your own, you've now got to have all the survival skills, just you. You've got to be able to do everything for yourself now. Maybe someone else always lit the fires. Maybe somebody else always made the bows. Maybe you don't have all the skills necessary because you were living in a group, so you didn't need all the skills necessary. But now you're on your own and you have no support, and you are fundamentally a social animal. And if you find another group, are they going to trust you? You've been cast out of one group. Why should they trust you? You're presumably an untrustworthy person, because that's the most obvious explanation for why you were cast out of another group. And for a man to be cast out is super dangerous. He's very unlikely to be trusted by another group. So if you're a man and you get cast out of the group as a hunter-gatherer, you're probably never going to reproduce. That's probably, and you are now an evolutionary cul-de-sac, probably. So men are going to be terrified of being cast out from the group. So they'll evolve instincts which are going to keep them in the group most of the time. How can you prove that you are definitely a member of a group? Well, if you fight for that group, that's pretty much proof. Oh, he served alongside us. Oh, we were storming that castle. I saw what he did. Oh no, he's one of us. You can definitely prove you are now one of the group by fighting with that group. So that's another reason. Again, it's to do with group belonging, group membership. Now, not only is it safer in a group because of the environment, because of the weather and food supply that you have to deal with, wild animals, but it's also safer because groups sometimes fight other groups, and the bigger the group, the more likely it is to win a fight. Yes, sometimes the smaller group will win, but generally a larger group, simply by just having more bodies in it, is going to win. But also larger groups have a bigger pool to pick from to get a good leader. They're more likely to be richer and therefore to have better resources and weapons and all the rest of it. Big groups over the millennia tended to beat small groups. That's not difficult to understand. So the general tendency in evolution is to want to be in a big group. So there was a study done on hunter-gatherers which said that if you doubled the size of a group of hunter-gatherers, it became about 15% more efficient. You can imagine that one guy might be the best at 4 skills in a small group, and when he's doing skill number 4, then he's not doing skills 1, 2 or 3, and nobody else can do them as well as he can. But in a larger group, division of labor can be so much more efficient. The guys who are good at the various different skills, because you've got so many more people who've got those skills, can then all be doing them at the same time. Everything becomes much more efficient. If one person goes out and fails to catch anything that day, in a larger group, someone will have caught something, and if it's a big deer, that'll feed everyone. Hunter-gatherer groups get 15% more efficient every time they double in size. So testosterone makes you seek status. I think I've explained why that's the case. Living in groups is a lot safer. I think I've explained why that's the case. Now, why would you live in a large group? What's the hormonal mechanism that makes you want to? Well, one of them is oxytocin. This is another hormone, perhaps you've heard of this. And perhaps you've heard it described as the nice hormone. It's sometimes referred to as the cuddling hormone. Oh, when a mother has a baby, she finds the baby so adorable, she just wants to cuddle it, and she gets a release of oxytocin, and that's what makes her want to cuddle it. So then she does cuddle it, and now she's cuddling her baby, and that causes her body to release more oxytocin. So you get a feedback loop. So oxytocin is the hormone which greatly facilitates the bonding between parent and child, and it extends beyond that as well. It's the bonding in all sorts of groups. So your comrades in an army might be bonded together to some degree because of oxytocin. The people that you see a lot of times in your local club doing that hobby that you love, you might have a degree of bonding with them through oxytocin. It makes you feel comfortable in their company. And that is clearly a good thing for a group living creature. So if you live in a big society, oxytocin, yeah, that's going to facilitate that. However, I'd just like to point out that there is a flip side to oxytocin, which perhaps you're not aware of. You may have heard of it, that it's the cuddling and the bonding and all things good, lovely, lovely, lovely hormone. But it's also the hormone that makes you distrustful of outsiders. We are us. They are not giving me an oxytocin hit. I see my friends. Every time I see them, I get a little bit, it's my friend, I haven't seen her for ages. Yeah, I get a little oxytocin boost. I see those people. I don't get it. Why don't I get it? Are they bad people? I don't trust them. Oxytocin is what can be so effective that it can cause people to launch preemptive strikes. Those people haven't done anything bad yet, but you launch a preemptive strike against them just in case they try anything bad. And yes, it's possible that you will end up one day having your head stoved in by someone who's just pumped up with oxytocin, the cuddling hormone. So, not so flipping cuddly now, perhaps. So there's a flip side to it. And tests have shown, for instance, that people will behave more dishonestly in support of their own group or against a group of some who are perceived as outsiders if they have a higher level of oxytocin in them. Yeah, so oxytocin, the cuddling chemical, and it's the distrust, the xenophobia chemical as well. Well, I talked about groups. What groups will people actually die for? Well, it's not brilliantly clear cut. It seems that possibly some people will die for their nation, whatever that is. Your nation might be your tribe. Some people might maybe die for their race, but I find that a little bit iffy. I mean, the concept of race as we now understand it's a bit of a recent invention anyway. It's so vague. Family, yeah, definitely. We can be very confident that there are people who will die for their family, or others, like perhaps the other men in their own section who have become like a family. They will die for a family, and if something can take the role of a family, like one section, which is about 8 men in a British platoon that you live and serve and eat with, that can become your family, and so maybe you would die for those, and maybe a terrorist cell could possibly become like a surrogate family, so maybe you could be persuaded to die for that family. In recent centuries, maybe there are people who have died for a political party, but that's about it. People don't die for their tennis club or their local library. Other things that create identifiable groups don't seem to move people to kill or to die. But sometimes an identity that's not particularly important to you, you might even openly declare it's of no importance, suddenly becomes extremely important when the proverbial hits the proverbial. There's a sudden threat to groups of a certain nature in your area, and you are now going to have to decide, of which group am I a member? We saw this horribly when the former Yugoslavia collapsed. So there were people who had been living alongside other communities, Muslims and Christians and Serbs and Croats and Kosovans and so forth, had been living alongside, even had intermarried quite happily for generations. And then suddenly, when that society broke down, they found that they had to pick a side. And okay, I'm going to be, I need a group to hide amongst for my own safety, because if I'm on my own and they think, and a load of those people come along and they think I'm with that group, I'm going to die. So I'm going to rush over there to those people who are my people. I think, well, actually those people are living, and my sister, oh, never mind, I'm going to go to that group. So you're then a member of that group, or rather you're amongst that group, but how do they know that you're really in that group? How can you prove it? Here's a Kalashnikov, go and shoot those people who used to be your neighbours. But if okay, right, yeah, I suppose I'm really with this group now. So your identity can suddenly be, if you like, activated from a state of dormance, and you have to choose a side, which is pretty horrible. And because big groups tend to beat small groups, what happens is violence leads to bigger and bigger groups. So one group beats this one, absorb it, shows what it can do, and then it's powerful, and then attracts more powerful allies who then team up with it. Groups become bigger, and bigger groups will tend to beat smaller groups, and this process goes on. So groups get bigger and bigger, and as groups get bigger and bigger, they fight less and less often, and they have less and less internal conflict, and so what you get is less and less fighting. So violence leads to bigger groups lead to peace. So violence leads to peace. Have I got that right? Is that right? I'll have to come back to this, because I think it's high time, frankly, that I talk to you about my sponsor being the Great Courses Plus. Now, what's the Great Courses Plus? Oh, come on, you know. The Great Courses Plus is a massive online resource. It's an on-demand video streaming service with loads and loads of lecture courses and all sorts of topics. How to do this, that and the other, cooking, photography and so forth. All lots of more academic-y things like science and history. And if you're watching one of these videos, you're probably interested in history. In fact, you might be interested to know that there's a course on psychology. It's a human behavior, the psychology of human behavior it's called. And it even has a lecture on war and family. And food. Actually, they've lumped food in with that one, which is a little bit odd, but anyway, war, family and food. And that's one of the lecture courses that you could try, possibly even for free, because if you were to go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindybeige, then you will find their details of a free trial offer, if you're not already a member, and you could take advantage of that. Or if you don't want to type in all that, you could just go to the description of this video and click on the link, which is much easier. So why not you just do that? Do that, and then you can go to the site and see all these amazing courses lectured to you by august academics from around the country who are members of all sorts of high prestige universities and the like. Although Actually, this does occur to me. I was trying to explain this to people. Really, the word professor is used very differently in Britain and in the USA. In the USA, if you lecture at a university, you're a professor. But in Britain, professor is the highest rank of academic. It's much more than just university lecturer. In fact, most university departments in Britain do not have a single professor. They may have many lecturers who are all doctors, but there might not be a professor. A professor has what's called a chair at a university, and occasionally, very occasionally, they create a new chair. So someone else can join the ranks of professor. But yeah, most departments in most universities do not have a single professor. It's a really, really high rank. So if someone's called professor and they're British, you should go, ooh. And if they're American and they're called professor, well, you could say, oh. But not ooh. It's not quite ooh. It's more Anyway, bit of a sidetrack, wasn't it? Oh yes, the Great Courses Plus. So I like the Great Courses Plus, partly because it seems to be such a great fit for my channel, and I've had quite a few, sometimes quite touching emails from people saying, "Oh, thanks for putting me onto the Great Courses Plus. I've really enjoyed the lectures." But also, it's about knowledge, and I approve of knowledge. Knowledge is good. I definitely prefer it to ignorance. So, the Great Courses Plus. Click on the link and give it a whirl. Right now, if a society is to be big and to last and to function, it has 5 problems to solve. You might think, oh, come on, it's got to be more than 5. There must be a myriad problems for a society to solve. Think of the drainage in the lower field, and the fact that one of our barns burnt down last week, and the people who live over there who are constantly complaining that they don't have proper access to the river. Oh, they're such pains. Well, yeah, you do have a myriad of problems to solve, but most of those problems are not going to be solved, or don't have to be solved, by the society as a whole. That drainage in the lower field, for instance, the people who know about drainage and who are going to be working on the problem themselves, they can do that. We can let them get on with that. Society, that problem will be solved for this society by people in that society, but the society as a whole has these 5 problems to solve. If it doesn't solve these 5, it won't be a society. First problem is identity. Who are we? What defines the group us? And one reason you might need to define identity, for example, is that maybe your society, as almost all societies do, you look after the weak, the infirm. When people are ill, you need someone to look after them, because we know they're going to get better again. When people are old, they need a little bit more help. How are we going to look after those people? Well, we can organise it amongst ourselves, but there's a cost involved. And if someone from another society who's not part of the group comes in amongst us and says, "Oh yeah, I want all that help, thank you, that'll be great," are we going to be helping that person? Because we're only a little tribe somewhere. We're not responsible, surely, for all the weak and the poor and the infirm all around the entire world. Who actually deserves to get the benefits of our labours in this? So who exactly is us? It's important. We need to know. Next one is hierarchy. Okay, who's in charge? Who's in charge? Because if we don't sort this problem, they're going to get loads of people saying that they're in charge, and other people saying, "Oh, you're not the boss of me. Who put you in charge? You're not my dad." And it's just the society's going to collapse unless we actually know who's running things. Okay, so you need to know who we are and who's in charge. You can see that a society would break down if you couldn't answer those 2 basic questions. Next thing, in this book, he calls it disease. I'm not sure quite that's the word that I would have used for this category, but anyway. This is, how do we behave so that we can all get on? It's like, what is the etiquette? How do we prevent outbreaks of disease happening, for instance? Could everyone use the loos are over there? Okay, the loos are over there. Please don't let anyone go. We're really sick. It's happened again. Someone shat in the woods. Okay, there's to be no shitting in the woods. Okay. The loos are over there, they're clearly marked. Can everyone please obey the rules and just go there for the good of everyone? Because if people are going to be shitting here, there and everywhere, this society is going to break down because there's just anarchy, frankly. So maybe we'll have a taboo. That's it, we'll have a taboo, okay? From now on, it's the taboo to do that, okay? In fact, I want you all to bring up your kids so that they are disgusted. They grow up with this idea that it is just disgusting disgusting to do that in the woods, frankly. And this has another benefit, because if ever you meet someone who doesn't seem disgusted about the idea of going in the woods, well, then they're probably not one of us. You've probably just detected an outsider. So it serves a dual purpose there. Okay, so disgust is a good thing. It'll keep everyone clean. It means that people will go in the correct place. There won't be the smell, there won't be the disease, and we'll all get on. There won't be arguments. Okay, so this one covers all the manners. How do you greet people? How do you treat older people, younger people, somebody else's children? All the various manners that we have to all observe so that we can all get on. What are the basic rules? Okay, what else? Trade. Trade is the fourth one. People have got to trade fairly. People have got to understand what weights and measures mean, what a deal is, how to honour a deal, and so forth. But you can see that a society that can't trade and come to agreements between people, that's not going to stick together long. And in this category comes marriage as well, which you could talk about as a trade between families within a society. If people don't all agree on which way the dowry payment goes and how much the dowry payment should be, and what happens in case of inheritance if one parent dies and then there are lots of kids, and which family has to look after the kids, unless we've got all that marriage stuff sorted out, this society is going to fall apart. So trade. Okay, so that's identity and disease and trade and hierarchy. Great. And last but not least, punishment. Okay, so who has the authority to deal out punishment? What is a fair punishment? If people are just taking the law into their own hands, willy-nilly left, right and centre, we're going to have all sorts of feuds erupting, and it's going to cause all sorts of splits in society, and we're all going to fall apart. So no, we're going to have some form of trial, some sort of punishment via authority. Only certain people are allowed to dish out certain types of punishment under certain circumstances to other people, otherwise this society is going to fall apart. So those are the 5 problems that any society has to solve. And in order to solve them, you can have mechanisms like, for example, religion. Maybe religions do well, they thrive if they solve those 5 problems fairly convincingly. So God decides who's in charge. We are us because we all worship God in the correct way, and other people who don't worship God in the correct way, they are them. We can have a load of laws on marriage and trade and so forth. There'll be weddings that'll be blessed by the church, and we'll trade, we'll bless the market cross or something. And punishment, religions love that. So this is one possible function of religions. They are for making groups stay together that are quite big. And if that's the case, then a group that's really quite big is also an effective military power. So if it's an effective military power, people aren't going to take it on. So it's stable because it has solved the 5 problems by various means, perhaps religion helping, perhaps not. And because it's big and stable, it lasts a long time, and nobody takes it on because it's too powerful. And it does seem that the bigger a group is, the more seldom someone does take it on, because of what I was saying earlier. So there are problems, though, aren't there? So a lot of Europeans have a meeting in a nice palace somewhere, and somebody draws a nice straight line on a map of the Middle East or Africa, and this divides the territory between one European power and another in the 19th century. But oh dear, you know the problem there, don't you? There will be tribes that straddle that border. And so immediately you've created an identity problem for that group. That group was stable, that group was happy, but now, hang on, who's us now? Are they them now? Because some of my cousins are the other side of the border. And I was going to visit them next year. We'd agreed. And they're subject to different laws now. Oh, their inheritance laws are different because the laws of that other country are different. And now I don't get what I was going to get when my uncle dies, who's living on. You destabilize a society by dividing it up like that. So that's a problem for identity. Another thing with identity is it's got to be costly. There's a weird thing. Similarly with a lot of religions, worshipping a religion has got to be very costly, so that it's not worth faking. If you have to give up loads of food and pray so many times a day and build a cathedral and pay a tithe and do all these really, really costly things, then you better be flipping committed to that. And similarly, if you want to be a member of a group and show that you're a member of a group, you've got to have the tattoo, obey the laws, learn all the manners, learn the language. Languages are really complicated. Why are human languages so flipping complicated? Well, one major reason, perhaps even the most major reason, is that they are deliberately complicated so that we solve the spotting the outsider problem. It's so difficult to convincingly become fluent in another language such that people can't tell that you're a foreigner. That language is a functioning barrier to keep people out of your group. If they can't say the word shibboleth properly, they are them, not us. And you can have sacred values like that not shitting in the woods thing. It becomes a sacred value if you've grown up with it. And if it's a sacred value to you, it's fundamentally in your nature, you actually feel physical disgust at the idea of someone doing that, then that's something you can't just trade away. You can't just I'll accept that just for the sake of a quiet life. You can't trade it away because it becomes a sacred value. It becomes a cost and it becomes unfakeable. If something is unfakeable or phenomenally difficult to fake, e.g. being able to speak another language so fluently that people can't tell you're a foreigner, then it works as a functioning barrier to a society. Now, bigger groups are less violent. And the trend has been over the years, over the centuries, for groups to increase in size. Now, we can look at the size of Europe in 1300. In 1450. In 1450, in Europe, there were 5,000 statelets, I might call them, or polities, political units capable of at least reasonably independent foreign policy, if you like. So not nation states as we now understand them fully, but something a bit like that. There were about 5,000 of them, all these little principalities, all these little dukedoms scattered across Europe. But 200 years later, in 1650, there were only a tenth of that. They were down to 500. By 1815, the Napoleonic Wars have ended. They're having a massive conference. They managed to get it down to 200 at that point. And today, there are about 50 states in Europe. Actually, the bottom of the graph is not today. 1953 was the very lowest point for a number of states in Europe. Places like Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania. They were all part of the Soviet Empire, the Warsaw Pact, and everyone in the West was terribly frightened. So there was the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and these were the big threats to each other. So people banded together and kept their units big. But now, and of course, Yugoslavia has exploded since then, and Czech Republic is now separate from Slovakia and so forth, no longer part of Czechoslovakia. Right. So the threat of the Cold War, it seems, was one of the reasons that there were fewer states then. And over that period, the amount of violence has gone down a lot. So in Britain, we have these court records that go back to 1300, and we can look at the murder rate. And the murder rate in England in 1300 was 23 per 100,000. Just to put that in perspective, that's somewhere around the murder rate today in Mexico or Colombia. So by modern British standards, eek! But actually by other standards, you might say, oh, actually, not so bad. Although I should say that modern El Salvador is way, way higher than that, 2 or 3 times that at least. And in medieval Europe, the murder rate was way higher than it was in England. But anyway, in England, we can say with fair bit of confidence the murder rate was about 23 in 1300. By 1600, it was down to 10. And today, it's down to 1. So England's become much, much, much safer place to be over that time. And of course, the units that we're living in, people used to regard their world used to be their village. And then after a while, they might have thought in terms of their county was their world. And now we think of Britain, or even thanks to the internet and cheap flights, we think of ourselves as global players now. Half my Facebook friends are not British. So as the groups get bigger, they get less violent internally, and they fight other groups less and less often. The world is getting constantly safer. How often did people go to war and become casualties? Is another way of looking at the same problem. The study was done in this. There was the worst offenders were the Cato tribe, and they had an incredible rate of 1,500 casualties per year per 100,000 people. That's 3%. 3% a year who are becoming war casualties, which is quite staggering. Let's put that in perspective. The average for a state since about 1800 is, I've got it written down on a piece of paper. Where is it? I wrote it down. The average is, oh, come on, 524. There it is. Now, for ancient Rome, to set it in perspective, ancient Rome was about 250. The USA in the 20th century, it was 3.7. And at the height of the War on Terror in 2007, it was 0.34. So from 0.34 of a big modern state, the USA, up to a small tribe, 1,500. So it's quite clear that over time, societies get bigger and violence goes down, and the violence of the biggest society goes down the fastest. So it seems that we are now, if you like, a domesticate species. We have to live in groups. If we were all evolved to live as hermits, we would have a completely different set of instincts, but we don't. We crave group membership. We don't want to be cast out. And if your tribe is going to go to war, you have to defend that tribe. And if you're not going to do your bit, then you might get thrown out. So you fight in order to stay in the group. That is why young men fight. Belonging. And that is what goes with the grain of human instinct. And it seems that we have, if you like, self-domesticated through an evolutionary process where the oxytocin hits we get, and the way we can get those oxytocin hits by becoming members of online little groups and getting little likes and so forth. Oh, a little hit of oxytocin. We have evolved a craving to be approved by those around us and to be one of the gang, and to live in a larger society and a safe society that will look after us. We have become a domesticated species, and in terms of safety, well, it seems to be working because there are now loads of us.
Lindybeige!